scientist walks into what looks like a pristine forest in Mexico. Birds dripping from the trees. It's a lush haven for a diverse range of songbirds. But then, the scientist looks down, and she realizes she's actually standing on a coffee farm. Migratory songbirds are some of the most extraordinary travelers on Earth. Tiny animals, many no bigger than your fist, flying thousands of miles every year between North America and the tropics.
There are roughly 650 species of migratory songbirds in North America alone. But since the 1970s, we've lost nearly 3 billion of them. This is the story of how that happened and what's being done to bring them back. I'm Dr. Rae Wynn-Grant.
This is Back From The Brink from Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom.
Each episode, we're investigating some of the most remarkable comeback stories in the natural world and the people who made it happen. Today, I'm talking with Kirstin Hill, Program Manager at Smithsonian Bird Friendly, one of the people at the center of a quiet conservation revolution happening one cup of coffee at a time. Migrations are one of the most incredible phenomena on this planet. You know, all kinds of species migrate. But for people who are maybe just getting started understanding migrations, can you tell me about, you could pick any bird you want, but can you tell me about like what it looks like over the course of a year?
So the annual migration cycle is something that does repeat kind of on the calendar year. So in the springtime, we are seeing the return of a lot of these migratory birds from their overwintering lands. So if we start at the beginning of the calendar year, you can think about them. They're spending their winter in these nice, warm areas, these tropical climates. So there's different migratory pathways around the globe. So for us, our overwintering period is going to be in that kind of that tropical belt. So that Central and Northern South America, that's where you're going to see a lot of the overwintering territory for a lot of these migratory birds. And then in the springtime, they leave their overwintering territory and they migrate back up north to their breeding grounds. And depending upon the species, that migratory route can really vary depending upon, you know, where it is that they're going, what their individual needs are as a species. But you're seeing these birds kind of come back up north for the warmer months for their breeding grounds. And that's where they'll kind of build their nests, they'll find the mate, they'll lay their eggs, they'll kind of go about the breeding process there and kind of have the next generation of birds. And then when the fall migration happens, they're leaving these areas as the weather starts to get colder and they're going and heading back down south for the winter. So that kind of annual migration cycle repeats each year, where the birds are kind of occupying two totally different environments in the summertime and in the wintertime, that in a way that kind of best meets their needs and allows them to survive and thrive. And in the meantime, they're taking these incredible journeys, flying sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles down and then back up again each year. And just to think about the phenomenon of that, of these tiny little animals that just they go and they go and they go and they go. And then when they get to their overwintering period, they need a place to rest and they need to be able to rest and refuel and kind of eat lots of nutritious foods that help them replenish all of that energy that they spent to get back down to the overwintering ground. So they spend that time resting and then they're heading back up north again this time of year in the spring.
I really often have to just take a little bit of a pause. You know, I cannot imagine it. I can't imagine humans doing it on foot. I can't imagine these birds doing it in the air. And yet they do, and they have always done. And we're really here to talk about like how they can continue to do this. And so can you talk to us about like the bad news here? So what are the threats to migratory birds in general? Are the threats more in the air as they're flying? Are the threats more on the ground? Is it their winter habitat, their summer habitat, both? I mean, what are the problems? What are the issues?
So unfortunately for migratory birds, it's in all of the above situations. So these are animals that present a unique conservation challenge because they occupy so many different places. So if you do a great job protecting the overwintering habitat of migratory birds, but there's still a lot of threats for them in their breeding grounds, that's not going to be enough for the species to persevere and to kind of continue.
The breeding grounds are usually, like if we're talking about those that are North American, their breeding grounds are here, like on our continent, in the
Right.
Mexico, US, Canada, the places where someone like me, might live and work. So sometimes we think about the migrations and like what's a problem, where they go down south, but truly their population is dependent on them having babies safely. And that happens up here.
Yeah, absolutely. So for migratory songbirds in particular, kind of one of the biggest, most prevalent threat, and this is going to be nothing new for anyone who thinks about wildlife conservation, is going to be habitat and habitat loss, habitat deterioration, and fragmentation, things like that. That's something that's happening at both areas, both in that overwintering land in the Central and South America when we think about them flying south, as well as in the breeding grounds up here by us in North America too.
What did these overwintering habitats used to look like largely? And then what kind of transformations are happening in many of these landscapes?
So when we think about the overwintering habitat for migratory birds, we're looking at ideally a pristine forest for them to kind of come back to. They need a place to stop, to rest and refuel. And so for a long period of time, there were, lots of abundant forests with lots of native trees, but over time, we've seen more and more of that habitat that's been converted for human use effectively. And a lot of that is driven by agriculture. So you'll see some land that is converted to pasture for cattle. So that means you're kind of clear cutting a lot of that forest. You're leaving almost no space for birds and biodiversity. And then in other areas, you're planting other things. And that can lead to sort of the removal of different types of trees. But in many cases, there's also a lot of ways where you can grow agriculture in a way that is also kind of in harmony with nature in that way too. So those are kind of the areas, the practices that we try to focus on when we think about what's a way for humans and birds to coexist in a way that's good for both.
Scale and the effect that the habitat that's been lost didn't really land until 2019, when a landmark study put a number to it. And that number was staggering.
When in the last 40 years, did we see that things stopped just kind of diving and started bottoming out and maybe populations increasing again?
So one of the biggest conservation stories for migratory songbirds in the last 40, 50 years or so was the paper that was published in 2019 that talked about the loss of 3 billion individual birds over basically since the 1970s, over the last 50 years or so. And so we just kind of, these things that our migratory bird scientists and many other scientists were noticing about the decline of birds. You're just seeing fewer and fewer birds. They were finally able to kind of quantify that and put that into terms that we could wrap our heads around. And just, it's such a staggering number to think that 3 billion
you're
birds,
saying we have 3 billion fewer migratory songbirds today than we did 50 years ago.
Yeah, that 3 billion number is birds in general, but a vast majority of them are these migratory songbirds who, as we were kind of talking about, they're facing these different threats at different points of the year during their annual cycle. So it's this habitat loss that's happening, at both the overwintering and the breeding grounds. We're also looking at things like window collisions and threats that are happening during the migration period as they're moving through their annual cycle. We didn't even talk about cats, but that's another, big threat for a lot of the bird species.
I'm with you.
Yeah,
I'm with you on cats.
Yeah, if, people are allowing their cats outdoors unsupervised, they're kind of picking off a lot of these, migratory songbirds because that's what they do. They're little predators. That's in their nature. There's no, no faulting them for doing what comes naturally for them. But we as humans have to be responsible and make sure that we're, behaving in a way that's setting our local wildlife up for success while also creating an enriching environment for our pets at home, too.
3 billion birds is an incredible loss. But decades before that, scientists knew that migratory bird populations were dropping. And at the Smithsonian, getting to the bottom of the problem led to a crucial discovery.
Our Migratory Bird Center was founded in the 1990s, but the work for migratory bird conservation kind of started long before that. And in the 1980s, the person who then went on to kind of be the founder of the Migratory Bird Center, Dr. Russell Greenberg, he was noticing a decline in migratory songbird populations in North America. So if you think about, 40 years ago, we're in the 80s, and he's noticing and trying to figure out sort of like, where are these birds going? I know they're here in North America during part of the year, and then they disappear, and then sometimes they come back and sometimes they don't. And we're starting to see fewer and fewer of these birds. So he kind of said, all right, I'm going to try to figure out where it is that these birds are going. He went down to Mexico to conduct a bit of research there and to try to see if he could find those same birds and figure out where it was that they were going when they left our areas in North America here. What he kind of found while he was down there was that there were lots and lots of birds in undisturbed forest. And he's looking around, he's trying to figure out, okay, what are the types of habitat that they're utilizing? He was on one area of a valley and heard a lot of bird calls and things like that happening. And he looked over and it looked like an area that appeared to be sort of like an undisturbed forest. Went over to check it out. And what he realized is that it was a coffee farm. So there was coffee growing in the understory and then lots of native trees providing high shade for birds, really high quality habitat. And, lots of this, this area that effectively looked like a forest, but was actually a coffee farm. And he said, this seems like this could be a really important habitat measure for migratory birds and providing a healthy overwintering habitat for them. And so that kind of led to just this concept that coffee could be grown in a way that was friendly to birds and biodiversity. And that sort of went on to become the Smithsonian Bird Friendly Certification Program.
This is just such a serendipitous story, right? And I think probably the biggest shock to Dr. Greenberg was thinking he's looking at what we're saying, like pristine, untouched, old growth forest, going in and actually seeing like, oh, this is a farm. Who knew a farm could look like this? Because certainly in North America, we at that time didn't have those examples. Many of us in the West are quite detached from the things we consume. Can you help me understand, what does coffee look like? Like, it's apparently not a tree. How does coffee grow, and how can that fit into a forest ecosystem?
So coffee is kind of like a shrub. When it's ripe, it's these nice, beautiful, bright red cherries that kind of grow out on the coffee shrub itself. And the shrubs, they can get to be quite tall. And so they can grow in the understory. So coffee is a unique crop in that it is perfectly happy to grow under the shade of trees. And that's actually how it was originally grown. And it was only actually up until the 1970s that most coffee was grown that way. And then around the 70s, that's when we saw the conversion of a lot of coffee farm from this agroforestry, where there's the agriculture kind of in the understory of the forest above, to the removal of a lot of the trees and a lot of the kind of the native plants and things like that are in there to grow coffee in the sun instead. And there are a number of different reasons why that change kind of happened. There's rising number of people who are drinking coffee, and the governments are kind of saying, hey, we want to make sure that we can keep up with this demand. And there was this idea that if you eliminated some of the shade trees, that you could, in theory, grow more coffee in that way, that the cherries would ripen faster, and that would be a higher yield for the producers there. There ended up being a big conversion of the way that coffee was grown from the agroforests, how it originally grew, into just this kind of clear-cut monoculture where the coffee is just kind of baking in the sun, and you're just seeing rows and rows of crops and very little space for birds and biodiversity to coexist in that way.
So we have a scientist who traveled down with a team and discovered, okay, there is habitat fragmentation and habitat loss, but it looks like there's also solutions at the same time. And then what stemmed from there?
What we ended up kind of seeing was, when Dr. Greenberg came back and was trying to figure out, what do we do with this information that we now have? So we have made this association that the agroforests can provide really high quality habitat for birds and biodiversity. the question then became, how do we incentivize producers to grow their coffee in this way? So for those remaining folks that have kept this high quality habitat on their land, how can we make it so that they feel there's a reason for them to continue growing coffee in this way? How do we incentivize that?
And let me interrupt you here just for me to get a sense. Like, tell me a little bit about the economics of this. Is it somehow like cheaper to do the monoculture where it's just coffee? Is it somehow more expensive for landowners to continue with the polyculture? Like why would someone choose one over the other?
So for each individual farmer, there can be, or landowner or producer, there's different motivating factors, and it kind of boils down to how you want to sell your coffee. So there's coffee that can be sold as specialty grade, and that's when we think about, high quality, high end specialty coffees versus your commodity coffee, which I kind of refer to as like your gas station coffee, where it's just like a mix of a bunch of beans, and we're not really sure where it's coming from, and maybe the quality is a bit lower. So there's a lot of different factors that can go into how a producer can sell their coffee and how much money they can get for it. So that was kind of what led to the creation of the bird-friendly program, was trying to find a way to provide this incentive for producers that they could get more money for their coffee. And Smithsonian will prove, we will vouch for them that, yes, this coffee is grown in a way that's really good for birds.
A decline of 3 billion birds, habitat loss on 2 continents. That might feel overwhelming. But inside the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, alongside the bird-friendly program, scientists are working on individual species recovery, including one of the most remarkable songbird comeback stories on record. A single species that came so close to disappearing that scientists were counting the males one by one.
You lit up a bit when you mentioned the Kirtland's warbler. And so again, I'm a mammal person, but can you tell me, just even briefly in summary, what is that story and why does it bring a smile to your face?
So these guys are one of the, unfortunately rare, but really great kind of conservation success stories for songbirds. So they went from a population of about 167 singing males in 1974, recovered all the way to being delisted from the endangered species list in 2019. So kind of really big recovery story there, down to just, a little over, between 100 and 200, individuals, singing males that you're seeing there. And the reason behind that is kind of twofold. So their decline happened because, in part, they're an incredibly range-restricted bird. So they only breed in young jack pine forests that are between 5 and 20 years old in a small corner of northern Michigan. So they have a super, super specific set of criteria that they need in order to breed. And if those forests aren't there, and if they aren't there in that timeline, so if they're too big or they're too small, then these birds can't breed in there. They can't thrive. And the other kind of big conservation threat for Kirtland's warblers was brood parasitism by a species called the brown-headed cowbird. So when we say brood parasitism, it's kind of a little bit of a mouthful, but that means that these cowbirds were coming.
But it doesn't sound good. That's for sure.
It's not. It's ugly. And so they were laying their eggs in the nests of the Kirtland's warblers, and they were kind of out-competing the warblers for survival. So they were the cowbirds were coming in, they were laying their eggs in the nests, and then basically leaving the Kirtland's warbler adults to raise and care for the cowbirds instead of their own young. And so we saw a big population decline there because of those two factors of just this lack of breeding ground that they had in this very, very restricted kind of territory. And then these cowbirds that were coming in and taking over these Kirtland warblers' nests. So what kind of ended up happening was we saw a kind of more management of the cowbirds. So they were kind of capturing them and removing them from there. And in 2019, that issue had actually been totally resolved. There was less than 1% of warblers that were still dealing with the brown-headed cowbird parasitism there. And so that was kind of like a big conservation success. So we said, hey, we took care of that problem. We managed those cowbirds to the extent that, that's no longer a threat for the Kirtland's warbler. And then there's ongoing kind of habitat management that's happening for, kind of keeping that breeding ground intact. So we're planting protecting new jack pine habitat. That's kind of helping them to recover and making sure that there's good management that's in there. So it's fire management has to happen there just to keep them at that right size. If the trees get, as I said, the trees get too big, then they can't thrive. And so for that, these are still a species that is kind of like a conservation reliant species. So their continued survival depends upon the ongoing habitat management that's in place there.
The Kirtland warbler went from 167 singing males to a completely recovered species. That happened because of dedicated scientists, active habitat management, and people who truly refused to give up. The story of migratory songbirds is still unfolding, but there's a role for all of us in it.
About how many coffee companies participate in the Smithsonian Bird Friendly program? Like, do we have a large variety to choose from? Where are we at? And do you think that that number will increase pretty soon?
So right now, if we think about coffee roasters, so coffee brands that you tend to see or are familiar with, we have about 110 roasters globally. So it's a smallish number in the grand scheme of things, but it's growing every month. So we're really excited to constantly be welcoming new coffee roasters into the Bird Friendly program, which really just kind of helps grow our presence and kind of makes the coffee more accessible to people who are interested in supporting it and looking for it. Now, of course, behind those folks in the supply chain leading up to that, we've got, a community of over 4,000 producers. So there's lots and lots of people who are growing this coffee, who are invested in protecting the land. And those folks are kind of at the heart of our program. We could not exist if it weren't for them and their longstanding commitment to protecting that habitat on their land.
That is such good news. I really did not think you were going to say a number that high. I think over 100 of these companies is major. I'm sure crossing that 100 mark was a huge milestone. And, who knows what the future brings? I mean, there is a potential for all coffee companies to get on board and realize that this is the best way to produce these products, to get them to people. Now, how would someone know that the coffee they're purchasing is bird friendly? Is there like a logo or an emblem on the bag of coffee? How can they distinguish?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got it exactly right. The easiest way to determine if a coffee is Smithsonian Bird Friendly certified is to look for that black and white logo that says Bird Friendly on it. It's got the Smithsonian and little sunburst on it. If you see that logo on a coffee product, then you know that it has been verified by us at Smithsonian as 100% of the coffee that's in that product is coming from a farm, a producer that is protecting really high quality habitat for birds and biodiversity on their farm. That logo tells you that that coffee is grown 100% organically, that it's deforestation free, and that there is, a diversity of native shade trees that are on the land that are really kind of helping to provide and preserve that important habitat for birds and biodiversity. I mean, I've been working in the conservation sphere now for, almost 20 years. And I have never seen a solution that is so simple and easy. And it doesn't require you to give something up. It doesn't require you to stop doing something. It's something that's accessible to you. I mean, for so many of us, coffee is like a multi-cup a day habit, right? So we need it to get up in the morning. We're not saying don't drink coffee whatsoever. We're saying, hey, make a switch to a coffee that is grown in a way that is really good for birds and biodiversity. And I think that's rare that we get that easy, a conservation win where it's just a simple switch that you can make and you can feel really, really good about the impact that you're having on there, because of the science and the rigor that's attached to, our certification through Bird Friendly. So I don't know. I always like to think about just sort of sipping my cup of Bird Friendly coffee as I'm, taking my daughter for a walk down the street and, you see, a wood thrush or you see a warbler fly by and that individual bird might be benefiting from the coffee that's in your cup because of those migratory patterns and because of that. This time of year when we're seeing these birds coming back into our communities, they're coming from these coffee growing lands. And the individual choices that we make by choosing a bird-friendly coffee, by choosing a coffee that's good for birds and biodiversity, that can make a difference for that individual that's right here in your community this time of year. And for me, every time I think about that, it gives me chills. It makes me think wow, that's a really awesome thing that I have the power to do. It's something that, I feel good about. It's something that I am excited about, and it tastes really good too. So that also helps.
110 roasters and growing. 4,000 producers protecting the land. And somewhere, right now, a warbler is making its way north.
If this episode sparked a little something in you, follow or subscribe, leave a review, or send to the bird nerd or coffee lover in your life. I'm Dr. Rae Wynn-Grant, and I'll see you next time.